Oh, thank you. You guys want to come closer? This stays on. This is like not want to just stay on.
This is like your perfect Zoom background.
I know. I swear. How'd you get yours to stay
It's
on?
like a magnet. Did yours? Do you have another? Oh wait, and maybe you slide it under there.
It's coming right out. Okay. Sure, I'm just like still.
What's that?
Yes, it's just so wait a few minutes.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Oh my God, this
Someone's
is not going to stay on.
us, so.
Sibby, this doesn't want to stay on my shirt. Is it missing something? Is this missing something? It's just like sliding right up.
Let me grab one for you.
Okay, because it just keeps coming.
So are you here for a while in LA?
Oh yeah, that's good. Perfect. Thank you. It's like July 12th.
Just for fun?
Basically, my kids are
Oh, they're in that camp, yeah.
So we're just in this. We're like, whatever. Stuart has a bureau, so he's just like working.
That's really fun.
LA bureau. Yeah, it's our third year doing it.
That's great.
It's so fun. Yeah, it's really fun. I love it. So it's just like a good getaway.
I'll have to see if there's. Yeah.
Okay. We're going to get started. 6 o'clock. Welcome, everybody. I'm Zibby Owens. Thank you so much for coming to Zibby's Bookshop. Those of you who haven't been here before, we opened in February of 2023. Tell your neighbors because people still don't know we're here. So spread the word, please. And we do lots of events just like this, and they're always available also on the live stream. And it's part of a whole bigger thing where I also have a podcast called Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books, which is how I met Julie.
Yes.
Back in the day. So I'll read their bios and then we'll have a lovely discussion. Also, tonight is very special because Tumbleweed is a sponsor of tonight's event and is gifting you all these books.
Wow. Thank you, Tumbleweed.
Yeah, so nice of them. What can I get to me? Okay, so here are their bios. Erich Schwartzel here is a journalist and author living in Los Angeles. His first book, Red Carpet, was published in 2022 by Penguin Press. Red Carpet detailed China's growing economic and political influence on Hollywood. It was a New York Times editor's choice, which is so hard to get, called a page turner by Foreign Affairs, and was named by Esquire one of the best books ever written about Hollywood.
Wow.
Since 2013, Erich has worked as a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He is at work now on a second book about the Star Wars franchise for Knopf. How's that going?
How long do you have? I'm like 3 months from submitting. So if we want to turn this into a group therapy session at some point, I'm more than happy to talk about it. Yeah.
Get back to that. Okay, and now Julie Satow is the award-winning author of The Plaza, The Secret Life of America's Most Famous Hotel, and now When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, Glamour and Power at the Dawn of American Fashion, which hit the New York Times bestseller list, which is so exciting.
Thank you.
A regular contributor to the New York Times, her work has also appeared on National Public Radio, Bloomberg Business Week, Travel and Leisure, and elsewhere. A graduate of Columbia College, she has a master's degree from Columbia University's School of International Affairs. I am particularly excited to read about this because I grew up with my mother dragging me to department stores all the time. In fact, my very first bra I bought at Bergdorf's, and I was so embarrassed that I hid between all the robes while she talked to the salespeople. So anyway, I'm very excited for your book and the whole conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Zibby. Thanks everyone for coming. We're going to talk for about a half an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions. So please be thinking about what you might want to be asking Julie. And then Julie will be here to sign copies of your books. But Julie, first of all, congratulations on this book. It is about department stores, but it is about so much else. It's about post-war America. It's about consumer culture. It's about the power of women. And the department store becomes this really unlikely canvas to paint on when you're exploring all those themes. I think the best thing to do would be, let's start with a reading, so people can get a sense of the approach and really the style with which you bring this history to life.
Thank you. That's such a beautiful intro, and I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Zibby, and everyone. I was going to read just like the first few pages of the book, of the prologue. So,
Just interrupt. There are more chairs if you all want to come. There are you here.
Oh,
you
yeah.
sit back here, and we can open up some more if you need them. So fill in these first, and then we can. There's one there. There's a seat here if you want to sit on the couch. Prime couch seat.
I think there's one there, or like, yeah. Oh, perfect.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. So this is like the first few pages of the prologue. Very start of the book. As ice gathered several inches thick on the Hudson River and the mercury plummeted below freezing, Hortense Odlum stepped from her chauffeured car onto the Fifth Avenue sidewalk. Gripping her felt hat to her auburn updo, she stared at the Art Deco skyscraper looming above her, at the two-story entryway made of filigreed bronze and glass, and the words Bonwit Teller etched prominently into the limestone facade. A morning rush of passers-by leaned against the gale, men lugging briefcases as they trudged toward glass-walled boardrooms, and women in nubby woolen coats ready for a day serving coffee and taking stenography. It was the height of the Great Depression, but even the ranks of the jobless seemed purposeful, huddling against the tall buildings to shield themselves from the biting cold, their bare hands outstretched in the hopes of a Christmas coin. Hortense pulled her fur coat around her and stepped gingerly through the revolving doors. At once, the scramble and blizzard outside fell away as an atmosphere of hushed grandeur and a blast of warm air enveloped her. She looked about the store's main floor, with its maze of glass counters and mirrored columns, the clacking of high heels against marble echoing through the vast space as a handful of early morning shoppers wandered the aisles. Eyeing the bank of elevators sitting along the far wall, Hortense walked toward them, clasping her purse nervously as she asked the operator for the 11th floor. She exited into a reception area, behind which were a series of Bonwit Teller's management had its offices. The secretary showed her to a nearby couch. Moments later, an elderly gentleman, dressed nattily in a three-piece suit with a shock of silver hair, stuck his head from behind one of the large wooden doors and waved her inside. Paul Bonwit, the 70-year-old merchant, gestured for Hortense to sit across from his imposing presidential desk, and she took her seat with a small, polite smile. Mr. Bonwit, who'd come from Germany in his youth and founded his store decades earlier, had spent countless hours charming wealthy housewives with his old-world manners and continental accent. But as he launched into a standard asking after Hortense's trip into Manhattan and how her children were faring, his typical ease faltered, and the air between them became stiff and awkward. Bonwit Teller had been one of New York's most exclusive, well-appointed department stores. But 3 years into the Great Depression, and shelves of baccarat glass sat unsold. On the cusp of bankruptcy, Mr. Bonwit had been forced to sell. The new owner, Floyd Odlum, was a Wall Street tycoon and one of America's richest men. So far, Mr. Bonwit had managed to keep Floyd at bay, holding on to his large carpeted office and his position as store president. But now Floyd's wife had made a sudden appearance, and Mr. Bonwit was confounded by the arrival of this 41-year-old mother of two. While she had shopped plenty, Hortense had never worked, and certainly not in a store. "There's a small office down the hall, Mrs. Odlum, where I hope you'll be comfortable," Mr. Bonwit finally ventured. "My secretary will be glad to take your dictation when you need her." Hortense's face reddened. She didn't want to be there any more than Mr. Bonwit wanted her to be. But her husband had asked her to make the rounds of the store and report back on her impressions. And while she had little idea how to proceed, Hortense was willing to try nearly anything to please Floyd. "What would I do in an office?" she replied nervously. "I wouldn't know how to act in an office, and I wouldn't have the faintest idea of what to say to a secretary." As their meeting concluded, he felt relief at Hortense's ignorance of the corporate world. But as he took his guest by the elbow and gently guided her toward the door, he had little way of knowing that Hortense's inexperience belied an instinctive business acumen. By the following year, their roles would reverse, with Hortense occupying the corner office at Bonwit Teller, sitting at the stately desk as her secretary took dictation, supervising more than 1,000 employees and directing a store that boasted record-breaking sales. Hortense was setting herself on a path that would thrust her into a career that she had never intended, that would challenge her notions of womanhood and force her to confront difficult truths. It was the start of a journey that would lay the groundwork for an evolution of the grand department store and a metamorphosis of American fashion.
Mm. That is how you start a book. Hortense is one of 3 women who are the primary characters in this story. You also introduce us to Dorothy Shaver of Lord & Taylor and Geraldine Stutz of Henry Bendel. And I love that description of you when you open the department store doors. But what explained the advent and the rise of the department store at that time?
Yeah, so department stores began at the beginning of the 19th century. Some of you might have heard of like Ladies Mile in New York. I'm sure there were LA versions, and basically they started in Paris. The first department store was Le Bon Marché. And New York was sort of the next city to get hit with department stores. And they weren't what we think of today as department stores. These were universes unto themselves. I mean, you could spend an entire day there. You could, obviously have lunch in the tea room. You could drop your children at the nursery while they entertain them and go shopping.
Adopt a baby.
Yes, one had like a publicity stunt where they actually had an adoption where for a week they put babies up for adoption. They had miniature zoos. They had dentist offices. I mean, these were entire worlds where women could go and explore and be around glamour and sort of that whole experience that they couldn't get at home.
And it was interesting because these 3 women who really revolutionized that business, it struck me that none of them were from New York. They had all spent time in other parts of the country.
Yes.
Did that inform their ability to basically centralize commerce and think about what would appeal to a very broad audience?
I do think so. So Hortense came from a very small town in Utah. Her grandparents were early converts to Mormonism. So they actually followed, the founders of Mormonism to this town, St. George. And she basically grew up in like a pioneer town. She made her own clothes. She made her own food. It was very different from Fifth Avenue in the world of department stores. And I absolutely think it helped her formulate how to sell to a broad swath of women. She had sort of a tagline that was, high class, not was what she would say, And Dorothy, the other woman from Lord & Taylor, she grew up in Mena, Arkansas, which is still a miniature town. I mean, I don't even know if you can call it a town. It's basically 2 streets. And she arrived in New York City in 1919 by herself, her and her sister, just a suitcase between them. And to give you context, that's before women even had the right to vote. They were, young women in their 20s, and she ends up being, president of Lord & Taylor by 1945 and America's #1 career woman, according to Life magazine. And the third woman, Geraldine Stutz, came from outside Chicago. She had a very strict Catholic upbringing. Again, not really fashion focused at all. And she came to New York City to work for Glamour magazine as a fashion editor, and eventually made her way to Henry Bendel's, which I get into. But
you mentioned in the opening that you read that Hortense had no formal training, no formal education. It seemed really like. Did you identify anything that was more like intuitive or innate in the 3 women that you thought made them succeed the way they did?
Interesting. Yeah, none of them, graduated college or had sort of a traditional path. And I do think that, I mean, obviously they had so much like pluck and ambition and drive. I mean, the 1930s, to be president of a company, department store, whatever it is, you can imagine as a woman how hard that would be, or the 40s or the 50s, which is when these women were coming up. So they had, so much drive and creativity, and they were able to, I mean, they were geniuses in their way, merchandising geniuses, marketing geniuses. So absolutely. Yeah.
And these very quickly became women's spaces, right?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that drove me to write the book is that I was so shocked at really the female universes that these stores were. I mean, we all have memories, or I have memories. I sort of caught the tail end of the department store era of, going with my grandmother, or, buying a bra. My daughter's over there. She might relate. Sorry, that was embarrassing. But they were these women-centric worlds where women had the power of the wallet in a way that they did not outside in their normal daily life, where they were buying things, and male managers, managers of the store, whatever, were having to serve them, and that gave them like a power dynamic that they wouldn't typically have. And then from an employee perspective, it was this amazing place where women could have these fulsome careers, and which in a time when it was so rare, and there were not a lot of other industries where that was possible. So,
well, you write that when the Great Depression breaks out, there's this backlash over how many women are employed by department stores, because men argue that those are positions that should be going to men who can support families with them.
So basically, that's true. So I kind of like structure the book like it's a narrative of these three characters. It's also a narrative of the department store and the history of department store and how it helped establish the American fashion industry. And then I also have sort of a history of women in work, because their stories were the stories of women in work and how women, entered the workforce. And I, as a working woman, felt, a lot of affinity for that. So it was really fascinating to see kind of the patterns of that. So in the, as I say in the book, in like the 1910s, you had women in their 20s who were going to Paris on their own, to the Parisian fashion shows, overseeing these big budgets and stuff in the 1910s. And the 1920s was this really wonderful time where, we all think of the flapper, for instance, right? And, it was like sexual liberation and financial independence for women. It was this progressive moment in time. And there were a lot of universities were opening up to women for their studies. This like great moment. And then, obviously women had the right to vote. And then in the 1930s, the Great Depression occurred, and obviously jobs were really scarce. And there was a lot of pressure on women to step back from the workforce and not work so that the men could work, with the idea that you had husbands to take care of you. And there were even like federal laws prohibiting the hiring of married women and forcing companies to fire married women. So it was really a difficult time, and they lost a lot of the gains they had. Then in the 40s, they get a lot more gains. Obviously, Rosie the Riveter, they all go to, a lot of men are drafted into the war, and it opens up all these positions, and women entered the workforce again. And then in the 50s, it was like, backlash again, you leave it to Beaver and that whole era. So it was a back and forth, definitely.
Well, I mean, as an author, the American century does like very few favors for you, because after you research the Great Depression, you have to research World War II and the outbreak of World War II. And I was fascinated to learn how the Nazis invading France had really left a vacuum for the gravitational center of fashion, because Paris had been that center, and then loses that influence after as the war breaks out. Was there a shift in the U.S.? Is that something that really shifted a lot of the power toward the U.S.?
Yes. So basically, that's right. So Hortense was there in the 1930s, and it was a complicated story. that she ended up president of Bonwit Teller. She had never had a paying job before. You know, it was this very amazing thing that she accomplished, and she turned the business around. Then in the 40s, really, Dorothy Shaver came up and she took over Lord & Taylor. And one of her major things was, you know, they both made a lot of contributions to the American fashion industry, but in basically Paris was always the center of fashion. You know, still even today we think of Paris as being the center of fashion. But what happened was when the Nazis occupied Paris, all of a sudden America was left adrift, and there hadn't really been an American fashion industry before that. You know, we had trade. In New York, we have the garment industry. You know, there were these big manufacturers that essentially were just like ripping off Parisian fashion designs and selling them for cheap to the American mass market. And that's basically what the American fashion industry was. It was like an oxymoron. You wouldn't even say that. And Dorothy, starting in the 30s, had realized that there were all these American designers and that there was really like a need for American fashion. And she began actually naming American fashion designers in her Lord & Taylor advertising. So it kind of started to get people to know about, oh, there are American fashion designers, like early ones, Claire McCardle, who created pockets for women, you know, like early sportwear, because the truth is in Paris, it was all haute couture. It was all very fancy and very expensive. And Americans, we wanted to go to the football game and wear sporty clothes or run around with our kids, and we had different needs. And so Dorothy started to realize that there was a market for that. So she really started to capitalize on this American fashion designer market. But then when the Nazis took over, it was all of a sudden like, it was a total open market for America because Paris was gone essentially. So she really pushed what became known as the American look, and it was essentially sportwear. And that's really why she's well known, and she's the most famous of the women. She actually has an archive in like the Smithsonian and stuff. I should say none of the women have ever had a biography written about them. So it was, it's not like, obviously you've never probably heard of Hortense Odlum or Geraldine Stutz, but they did important things. So Dorothy really created this American look and made American fashion be an actual thing. So that was.
There are photos of the American look at the end of chapter 6.
Yeah, from
like
Life magazine.
Very like Katharine Hepburn.
Yes,
chic.
yes.
Yeah.
So it was the war, obviously. So Life magazine ran these obviously they have big photos in Life magazine. So it was all these like very beautiful American girls wearing shorts, and and all these soldiers, wrote Dorothy all this fan mail asking like, can you please introduce me to these models? So yeah, that was, but that was really the big American look push that she did. Yeah.
Well, it reminds me of, it seems like a precursor to the influence that someone like Anna Wintour would have a few years later, a couple decades later. She won't want to hear it a few years later, a couple decades later, of sort of anointing a look or anointing a designer.
Yeah, actually, I think of, and actually my husband used to say this to me, like Geraldine Stutz, the third woman, is kind of to me like the precursor of Anna Wintour more, because I should say each of the women were incredibly different and they had very different lives and, behaved very differently. Hortense was married, as I said, although the marriage broke down. Dorothy very much aped a male CEO. She was a spinster. She lived with her sister her whole life. She was never married. She didn't have a love life as far as I could determine from the documents I could find, the research. And she was very committed to her career. And like her best friend was this guy, Tom Watson, who ran IBM in the 40s. She was really like, and she was very politically active, and she had this amazing life and, very, during the McCarthy era made a lot of speeches and stuff, but she was very much not, did not embrace her femininity, I should say. And Geraldine Stutz was more of a modern version of what we think of as the businesswoman. She was appointed president of Henry Bendel's in 1959. She was only 33 years old at Glamour magazine. She was beautiful. She modeled in college. She was very fashion I have pictures of her in the book too, of like, she wore a turban all the time. She had like, totally, she was very glamorous. So like kind of the Anna Wintour in the sense of like, the sunglasses had her look. She definitely had her look, lots of bangles, big turban. And she was responsible really for what we know of as ready to wear or pret-a-porter, because in the 60s, when she was president of Bendel's was a much smaller department store than Bloomingdale's or Macy's, and they couldn't really compete buying the same amount of clothes as these other bigger stores. So instead, she had her buyers, instead of going to the haute couture fashion shows in Paris, to go walk the side streets of the left bank and try to find these small little designers that were making interesting clothes and bring those back to America. And that was really the start of ready to wear. So like Sonia Rykiel and all these designers, she really helped discover them, important designers that weren't, known. And so in that way, I think of her more as like the Anna Wintour, because she is responsible for so many important careers of designers, of Stephen Burrows, and sort of earlier than now. So I had not heard of them. I am not a fashion journalist. I did not know who they were before I wrote the book, but they were very important. So.
When you have three central characters like that, is there a moment when you've done enough research, you've done enough work on their lives and their milieu, that you can switch into writing confidently about what they must have been feeling, what they must have been going through? Is there a moment like when you're studying a foreign language and you start dreaming in it, like when you can switch over?
Right, kind of. It's hard because like sometimes I wished I wrote fiction, because if it was fiction, I would have had them all meet. I would have known exactly what their dreams were. You know what I mean? Like I wanted to do that. I was limited, obviously, by what I could discover. And as I mentioned, there wasn't like a ton of material on all of them. I did a lot of research, which I can talk about, but I did like try to get really close to them, like intimate with them in a way that I could without ever interviewing them. Obviously, none of them are alive anymore. With Hortense, she had written an autobiography in 1937. So it was largely fake. A lot of it was not true, which, she sort of like made everything sound much better than it really was. So that was complicated, but it did give me like the words I have in the intro, like the dialogue between her and Paul Bonwit was from her memoir. That's how I got that. So I did have some of that with her. I also, she was a Mormon, and they're very interested in their genealogy. So there's actually like a pioneer museum in her town, and it had just like all the stuff about her genealogy and how she grew up and stuff.
Great.
So that was really great. And then with Dorothy, as I mentioned, she had an archive in the Smithsonian, so that was great. But I actually hired a genealogist because she was never married, and I could not find any living relatives for her. So I hired this genealogist who actually found her like great niece. And you can maybe appreciate how great this was. I called the woman up, and she's like, "Oh yeah, my basement is filled with documents. Come down and check it out." And I was like, manna from heaven, like amazing. And her sister, Elsie, who Dorothy lived her whole life with her sister, was an artist. And Elsie had all these drawings and stuff, but she'd also made all these scrapbooks of their life together. So, literally talking about arriving in New York by themselves in 1919 and what that was like. And that was just amazing. So that helped give me like that color and that more intimacy. And it was a lot of, her scrapbooks were a lot about them growing up and their families. And so it really helped fill out that part of the story. And then for just more modern, she died in 2005. So I did like just regular reporting for her. Her sister had 7 children. As I said, she was a very Catholic family. And so they were alive. So I interviewed them. And then women who worked for her are still around. I was able to interview like tons of Bendel's employees who could talk about what an amazing boss she was and stories about her and how that was. So that helped. Not for her, that was harder because she was very private, and she married for a while but divorced, and her stepdaughter, who was amazing and lives in London and actually came to New York for the book launch, helped give me some, but she was a young girl when, you know, her parents were married, so she stayed close with Geraldine her whole life, but it was very hard to find that sort of intimacy for Geraldine. But
you know, it's interesting because your first book was on the Plaza Hotel.
yeah.
This is about three women. It's about the American century, but it's also about three locations. And you live in New York. I'm curious, when you're working on these books that are so tied to a specific location, what's your relationship with that location whenever you're writing the book?
I know, it's kind of cheating. I mean, maybe you feel like this with LA, I don't know. But like, I know it so well that it's like one thing I don't have to research. You know what I mean? Like, I remember Lord and Taylor's, you know, that's where my dad's parents always used to buy us presents for the holidays or birthdays and stuff. You know, I remember those things. So I have like kind of a shorthand for that. So, but I do want to stretch myself. So hopefully my next book is not going to be New York centric, but
or
that's
dart at the map.
Exactly. Maybe Mena, Arkansas.
Yeah.
No, but yeah. So yeah.
Do you visit the locations while you're working on it?
Yeah, I do. I mean, like I went to Mena, I went to St. George, I went to, you know, Evanston, where Geraldine was from. I spent time there. I think it's really important to do, you know. Bendel's doesn't exist anymore. You know, Bonwit Teller is now Trump Tower, which we can get into, but that's what is there now. And, you know, Lord and Taylor is Amazon headquarters for the Amazon company.
Wow.
So I can't really like go in now. Yeah. So
the metaphor writes itself.
I know, exactly.
Yeah,
That's so right. Exactly.
I have one more question before we open it up to the audience, which is you know, we're in a city that has its own history of shopping culture. We've done quite a bit to popularize the mall and many other aspects of consumer culture, for better or worse. When you are shopping today, whether it's at a mall or at a Target, what do you see that reminds you of these three women and their influence that echoes through the years?
Oh, that's a hard question. Nothing. No. I mean, you know, I think that, well, first of all, if you've ever used a personal shopper, that was Dorothy Shaver who came up with the idea for a personal shopper. So my mom likes a personal shopper. So, you know, that kind of reminds me of that. You know, a lot of the designers, you know, so Geraldine was very much more like a modern woman, as I mentioned, and her ideas of like femininity and being a businesswoman is something that we would relate to as a more modern reader, but she still had a lot of like internalized sexism. So one of the things was she was like very sizist. So Henry Bendel's only carried like up to the equivalent of a size 6, okay, which is great for petite women, but really sizist. So like that, when we're always having these discussions about like, you know, sizing and stuff, I think about that. But also, you speak about malls. I mean, Geraldine also came up with the idea of a boutique within a store. So that was her. So every time you now go to Target and you see that they have Ulta Beauty in Target, that is Geraldine's idea, you know? So, and Hortense, you know, it was the 1930s and she insisted that these garment manufacturers, these old grizzled factory guys, stop making these cheap clothes with all these doodads and make some very simple, affordable, well-tailored clothes for women who are on a budget. And so, you know, when we think of, you know, discount stores, in some ways, that's sort of Hortense. So I don't know.
Wow.
Coming off the top of my head with that.
That's quite a bit. I shudder to think what any of them would think of the Beverly Center. Let's open this up. Yes?
Hi.
And I'll repeat the question for everyone.
Yeah, thanks for writing this.
Oh.
So I'm watching on Hulu a documentary about Diane von Furstenberg, and it's very fascinating because I didn't know if she grew up. She was Jewish, and then she married the prince of Germany and that was von Furstenberg.
Yes.
But I'm just wondering if in your book you discuss female designers like that.
Yeah, so I should say that, and the way I structure the book is there was like so much cool material that I did not want to edit out. So I have the three main women, as I said in the narrative, but I have these things I called vignettes. I don't know, where I have little like side stories that I felt like were just so fascinating and important and really helped like fill out the whole narrative. So I have like the first, this woman who opened the first Black-owned female department store in Richmond, Virginia, which, as some of you might know, is the seat of the Confederacy. And this was right after the Civil War. So you can imagine it was a group of Black women who opened this department store. I do have, sections on some designers. I have on, the mannequin. What is the mannequin? How did that happen? Different, also some characters, Hattie Carnegie, some of that. So yeah. Interwoven through. It's a lot of material. Yeah.
We can just work this way across the room.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Hi.
So how long did it take you to research this, and what was the spark? Because this is quite an undertaking. How did you? 'Cause
Yeah.
You said you gave the disclaimer. I'm not a fashion person.
I'm not. Yeah. Yeah, I know, right? Yeah. So it took me about 3 years to research it and write it. I like fashion. I was a business reporter. Was my training. And so after I had written the Plaza Hotel, my agent was sort of like, so what's next? And she liked the idea of Store Wars was her pitch, not Star Wars, but
Star
sort
Wars
of
is
like
good, too.
tension about department stores, something about that. But I really did not want to write a book about a building again. I just felt like that was limited in its interest. So I just started like diving into this world and reading about it. And then I stumbled on Dorothy and Geraldine, and I was like, oh my God, these women are amazing and no one's ever heard of them. And these stories are incredible. And then I found Hortense and I felt like, oh wow, the three of them tell this really interesting story of the 20th century of women and of fashion. And I just felt like it was so rich. And I think part of being a journalist is you don't have to write only what your beat is, so I learned about it. No one has made any corrections yet, so I think I'm okay. But I feel like, and I've said this in other talks, that, it's like a continuum. I feel like the women were talking with each other, even though I do believe that they knew I think that Geraldine and Dorothy knew of each other. I had like some documents that show that they were at the same luncheons and stuff, but not like that they ever really interacted. But I always felt like they really built on each other in terms of their careers, and that they sort of had a conversation going between them. And I kind of felt like, as this modern woman, I was having conversation with them too. So it just felt like this really nice arc to do it. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think, I was thinking, I haven't read this yet, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
If it's covered,
It's the
but do
point.
you think, I wasn't really familiar with any of their names, but that they're somehow inspired in any sort of like current pop culture, television movies? I think of like the woman in the one Mad Men.
Exactly.
Series.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. So
was the managing her
yes.
family's department.
Yes. So I actually wrote about that in one of the vignettes I have about Jewish women merchants, because these women are not, and a lot of people think of that. And there's a deep history of Judaism and department stores. So in Mad Men, there's Rachel Menken is the character, and she's supposedly Don Draper's one true love. And she took over her father's department store after he died, and she goes to the Mad Men, to try to get advertising to revamp her department store. And I believe, even though I don't have proof, that was very, very much based on Beatrice Fox Auerbach, who actually ran G. Fox's in Hartford, Connecticut. It's the exact same scenario. She was a single woman. She was Jewish. She took over the department store from her father. She was very beautiful and interesting and did a lot of really amazing pioneering things. And I don't know. So, Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, there's a lot of that is in there. So yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
How is it, or do you talk about the men that ran like Macy's at the time, or like was there that competition, and how was that?
Yeah, really good point. So when I started researching the whole thing, I felt like there had been a lot written Roland Macy's or the Bloomingdale brothers. There's actually books about their stuff, and they absolutely have interesting narratives, and they founded the stores. And I should say the reason why these three women are so I write about them is because they're very rare. Women had a lot of agency in these department stores and had big jobs and managed people and had big budgets they were in charge of, but the men were very much in charge. I mean, as I say, in the book, the men's names were on the building, but inside women ruled, and women were like very much the engine, but the men had the most senior positions. So I do talk a little bit about that. There was a real paternal aspect. I think I said in Filene's, for instance, Edward Filene used to make everyone call him dad. All the saleswomen, there's like stuff like that, so I do talk about it, but yeah, I feel like that story had largely been told and that the women's stories just hadn't.
But were they accepting of the women?
So, yeah.
These businesses and
So
being successful?
all three of the women in that I feature had male mentors who really helped them. I don't think it would have been possible without those male mentors. Hortense had her husband / ex-husband. Dorothy had the president of Lord and Taylor was very, very advanced in his thinking about women, and he just kept promoting her. And Geraldine Stutz, there was a guy who owned a big shoe company who knew her from Glamour and thought she was amazing and plucked her. And when he bought Bendel's, installed her as president. So that kind of mentor really did pave the way, and it would have been like basically impossible without that for them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. As a business reporter, when you were researching these department stores, most of them are gone.
Yeah.
They've been bought out. Lord Taylor. I remember shopping there.
Yeah.
Macy's. I think part of Federated now.
Yeah.
Bloomingdale's part of
Who
Federated.
even knows?
So
Yeah.
there was a lot of consolidation,
Yes.
buyout. Were department stores run because of the quote unquote concierge service and the consumer comes first? Was there a lack of efficiencies that other companies saw an opportunity to increase efficiencies, lay off people, and increase profitability?
Yeah.
And kind of tarnish the name of the department store.
Yeah, so basically, I talk about that in the book. So in the 1950s, obviously there was like suburban expansion. So the department store started opening branch stores, and that started to dilute their brand and hurt their downtown stores. Then in like the early 1960s, basically Walmart, Kmart, and Target all opened in the same year. And those discount stores started to undercut their prices. And so they, department stores, the first thing they did was start cutting salaries. Then they started cutting services. So it was like this downward spiral where they were cutting. Then, as you said, like they started consolidating. They tried to do all these things to try to compete. Essentially, when they started consolidating, you had some guy in Detroit buying for Pittsburgh. So it was like it didn't even make sense. It wasn't really, they didn't understand the community anymore. So it kind of was what happened, and then it just snowballed, basically.
We have I think time for one more question. So. We have time for two? Yeah.
Okay.
Two more questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious, similar question to the previous one, which is like, so there were these women who worked in like male-run institutions. Like, did they ever talk about or like dream about creating their own businesses? And like, what do you think, or like just your own speculation, like what would if they could have like created their own department store or like.
Yeah, that's a very like modern point of view, because like I don't think they could have ever gotten the funding or the back. Like in the 1930s, you should hear the stuff like Dorothy was there was so much sexist language around who she was. Even like Life magazine did this big profile on her, and they were like, oh, most business women are terrible, we hate them, right? But she's of the little woman school. She's scared of the thunderstorms, and that was the way they like made it appealing or acceptable. Do you know what I mean? So no, I don't think that would have really been possible. I mean, there was, like I mentioned, this Black-owned department store in Richmond, Virginia, right after the Civil War, which was amazing. But all the white retailers banded together and basically forced all the wholesalers to boycott them, so they didn't last more than like a handful of years. I don't know. So yeah.
All right, sir, bring us home.
Well, I'm fascinated by your focus, and the word entrepreneurship sort of rings in my head because I went to business school, and I think this would be a great case study.
Oh yeah,
you're
happy to come talk.
My question is, with great accomplishments come great sacrifices, and the thing that I really want to know, my heart is beating fast, is what did each of these three women give up or sacrifice, or were you able to discover sort of the power of what they did, but also the downside of what they were able to accomplish?
Yeah, I absolutely they did. And I would say Hortense is probably the most like poignant of them. It was really hard to write her story because she ends up hating her career. And she says it was the worst thing that ever happened to her. And, she thinks that women should never be in business. And it was, women belong in the home. That was her, like, that is how she ended up feeling about everything. So it was really brutal to write. And actually, the way I wrote it at first, I was sort of like, it's hard to kind of feel compassion for that from our perspective, and understand why that was. And when you read the book, maybe I would love to hear from you and see what you think. But my fact checker was the first person who read the book. And she was like, I'm so mad at you at the way you portray Hortense. It's so unfair. You need to like go back and think about it. And so I really did sort of rewrite that and like really try to find more compassion for it because of, but yeah, they all did. I mean, as I said, I couldn't even find really a personal life for Dorothy beyond the store. I think she, and Geraldine also had a lot of stuff go on. So I think yes.
Super powerful.
Yeah.
Terrific question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Julie,
guys.
congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Before Julie starts signing, I just wanted to introduce, and I'm Zibby for those who walked in late. I wanted to introduce Liz.
Not at all.
Okay, Liz, why don't you talk, because we have a special sponsor, which I mentioned at the beginning. All the books are free. They are gifts, right? As hardcover goodies. So
$33. Thank you.
So go on. Stand up.
Hey, thank you.
So I own Tumbleweed Day Camp. We're a local camp very close by, and we've had the pleasure since January of being a partner with Zibby's here, of doing a whole bunch of different events. And Julie and her family are members.
We
of
are.
our camp.
My kids are right there.
When we came in, so coming, but it's just been a real pleasure to be in partnership with this store and in the community. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
One last thing, and she's not going to like this very much, but we also have a special guest in the audience. Do you mind standing up? So this is Lara Love Hardin, who wrote The Many Lives of Mama Love, which was Oprah's book club pick 2 months ago, 3 months ago, something
Amazing.
like that. So she's just here as a fan. You might have some copies of her books. Anyway.
Come sign with me. Yeah.
So thank you all so much for coming. Please come back, join the mailing list, tell your friends, and enjoy Julie's book, and post about it if you love it.
Yeah.
Okay?
That's great.
Post about it.
I have to say,
Okay, so you can just line up and she'll
incorporating
sign right over
your
there.
kids' summer camp into your book tour is a new level. A new
That was
level.
I saw that they did it for a different book, and I was like, "That's where my kids
Oh.
go to camp." And I was
So
like, "So
that's like new. I
you
admire
can be
it
in,
so.
be in on that." Oh yes. Oh yes, I know. Yes. So nice.
So excited.
Yes.
It's really.
Oh, good.
And the photo, I mean, I picture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so really, My family is part Romanian, and Romania really was
Very fun for me
high
too.
fashion.
Yeah,
Would
wow.
that be more patterns?
I don't really know.
I know.
I sort of, Romania is so beautiful, actually.
It
My
was high fashion.
husband and I went there. Yes, it was high fashion. That is not in the
I'll
book,
Google
but
it.
okay, I will.
And then